The first thing I noticed was that I wasn't dead. This surprised me because the last thing I remembered was the building coming down. The second thing I noticed was the ceiling. It was wrong. Too high, too curved, made of something that wasn't concrete or steel or any material I'd trained in. Alien architecture, which meant I wasn't in a field hospital, which also meant something had gone very differently than expected. The third thing I noticed was her. My name is Corporal James Rook, Terran Expeditionary Corps 4th Infantry. I've been part of the ground assault on Kale Voss, a Vael city on the edge of contested territory, population unknown. Strategic value high enough that Command had decided it was worth taking at any cost. I don't know what that cost ended up being. I know what it cost me personally: 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a head wound that had bled enough to soak through 2 layers of armor padding, and 3 days of consciousness I apparently couldn't account for. She had kept me alive through all of it, and she had no idea who I was. She was across the room when I fully came to, crouched over a small device that I gradually recognized as a medical scanner, running it over something I couldn't see. Her back to me, silver gray skin, amber gold bioluminescent markings along her jaw and the back of her hands, moving, shifting, the way I'd learned Vael markings did when their owners were concentrating hard. A medic's satchel at her hip, worn and heavy with use. I took stock very carefully and very quietly. I was in what had been, before the bombing, some kind of ground floor room in a Vael building. 2 walls still standing, 2 collapsed into rubble. The ceiling above held up by what looked like sheer structural stubbornness. Through the gaps in the walls I could see the city, or what was left of it. The assault had been thorough. My armor was partially removed, the chest plate gone, the left shoulder assembly gone, and my wounds had been dressed with materials I didn't recognize. Tight, clean work. Professional. Whatever she had used had clearly done something, because the pain in my ribs was present but distant, like it was happening to someone I was only mildly concerned about. My sidearm was still in its holster. She hadn't taken it. I tried to sit up. The pain reasserted itself immediately, and I made a sound I hadn't intended to make. She spun around in an instant, fast, combat-trained reflexes under the medic's manner, and was across the room before I finished the movement. She said something in Vael, sharp, quick, a command, or a warning. Her hands were already moving to my shoulder, pressing me back down with firm, careful pressure. Not violent, but not optional. I looked up at her from flat on my back, and she looked down at me with those split pupil amber eyes, and we stayed like that for a long moment while we both processed the situation. Then she said something else, shorter, quieter, and held up 3 fingers. 3 days. She was telling me I'd been out for 3 days. I didn't know how I knew that. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the context. Maybe after enough time watching people trying to communicate across language barriers, you develop a sense for it. 3 days, I repeated. She nodded, which meant Vael nodded the same way humans did, and that felt like the strangest detail I'd encountered in 6 years of service. She told me later, much later, when we had developed enough shared vocabulary to have something approaching a conversation, what those 3 days had looked like from her side. She had been in the building when the assault started. Not a soldier, a field medic attached to a Vael civilian evacuation unit, trying to get a group of non combatants out of the city before it became a battlefield. The building had taken a hit from Terran artillery. The evacuation unit had scattered. She had been separated. She found me in the rubble of what had been a market district, half buried under a collapsed wall, breathing, but barely. No tags visible. My external insignia had been shredded in the collapse. No uniform features she could immediately read as enemy, just a person, dying. She was a medic, so she did what medics do. She moved me to the most structurally stable building she could find within carrying distance, which, given that she was a foot taller than me and built proportionally, turned out to be further than I would have expected. She treated my wounds with what was left in her satchel and then supplemented with materials she had scavenged from collapsed med stations in the surrounding blocks. For 3 days she'd kept watch, kept me alive, gone out twice to find water and additional medical supplies, leaving me unconscious and alone in the ruins, and come back both times. She could have left. She had her own survival to think about. A city in ruins, her units scattered, Terran forces still moving through the streets. She stayed because she was a medic and I was a patient, and to her, in those 3 days, that was the only thing that mattered. She didn't know yet that I was the enemy. It happened on the 4th day. I was conscious and stable enough to sit up on my own, and she was redressing the wound on my left side, working with focused efficiency, when her hand brushed the inside of my armor collar, where the unit patch was. 4th Infantry, Terran Expeditionary Corps, the unit that had leveled Kale Voss. I felt her go still before I saw her face. A total, absolute stillness. The kind that isn't calm, but is controlling something that isn't calm. Then she sat back and looked at me. I've tried many times to describe what was in her expression in that moment, and I've never quite gotten it right. It wasn't hatred. I'd expected hatred, had been braced for it, and hatred would have almost been easier. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the blatant shutdown of someone who had made a decision and is acting on it. It was something more complicated than any of those things. It was the face of someone who had just discovered that a fact they had thought was simply, I am helping a person who needs help, has become a question they don't know how to answer. She stood up slowly, moved to the far side of the room, stood with her back to me, those gold markings moving in patterns I was starting to read like weather, agitated, cycling, the color of something working through a problem it hadn't anticipated. I didn't move, didn't reach for my sidearm, didn't say anything. I just waited, because whatever she decided in the next few minutes, I'd already decided something. Whatever she was working through over there, duty, conscious, 3 days of a choice that couldn't be undecided, she deserved the time to work through it without me making it harder. She had kept me alive. The least I could do was let her think. She stood with her back to me for a long time, long enough that I started doing the math I'd been avoiding. My unit was gone, scattered or dead. I had no way of knowing. My comms were destroyed in the collapse. I was in a bombed out Vael city with no extraction plan, no backup, and injuries that meant I wasn't moving fast or far on my own. If she walked out that door, my odds dropped to somewhere near zero. If she turned me into whatever Vael military presence was still operating in this city, my odds were only marginally better. And she had every right to do either of those things. I was the enemy. My unit had done this to her city. Whatever she was weighing on the other side of that room, she wasn't wrong to weigh it. When she finally turned around, her expression had changed. The conflict was still there. I don't think it ever fully left, but something had settled underneath it. A decision made. Not easily, but made. She crossed the room, sat down beside me, picked up the bandage she had put down when she found the patch, and kept working. I watched her hands, steady, professional, the hands of someone who had made a choice and was living with it. I tried to find something to say that wasn't inadequate. Why? I finally managed. She looked up, didn't understand the word, but understood the question. I was getting better at that, at reading the moment when meaning crossed the gap without language. She was quiet for a moment, then she touched the medic's satchel at her hip, tapped it once. Then she pointed at me. It was the simplest sentence I'd ever heard. I am a medic. You are a patient. Everything else is secondary. Getting me out of Kale Voss took 2 more days. She knew the city, had worked it for months as part of the evacuation effort, and she moved through the ruins with the quiet competence of somebody who had already memorized which streets were clear and which ones weren't. She set the pace. I followed. Slower than I wanted to be, ribs reminding me every few steps that I was not at full capacity. We didn't talk much. We didn't have the language for it. We developed a working shorthand, gestures, expressions, the occasional word repeated enough times that it acquired shared meaning. Her name, as best as I could reproduce it, sounded something like Seva. She seemed to accept my approximation without complaint. She was careful with me in a way that wasn't soft. It was practical. She needed me mobile, and she calibrated everything to keep me that way. Rest when I needed it, pace when I could manage it, a look that said push through it when I was slowing down for reasons other than actual physical limit. On the second day, we walked into a Terran forward position. The soldiers there had their weapons up before we cleared the rubble line. I had my hands raised, identification already called out, moving slowly. Seva had her hands raised too. She watched me and mirrored the gesture without being told, reading the situation with the same rapid intelligence I'd been watching for 6 days. Stand down, I said. She's a medic. She kept me alive. Nobody points a weapon at her. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds longer than I was comfortable with. Then the weapons came down. Command debriefed me for 6 hours. They were very interested in Seva, very interested in what she told me, which wasn't much, practically speaking, because we still didn't share enough language for operational intelligence, even if she had been inclined to give it, which she wasn't. They were less interested in my recommendations that she be treated as a non-combatant and released, but they followed it, eventually. She was gone before I was out of the medical bay. I think about Kale Voss sometimes, about what it looked like from the ground after the assault. The ash in the air, the architecture that had stood for centuries, reduced to rubble in a morning. About the evacuation unit she had been separated from and whether she ever found them. I think about the moment she found the patch, about the length of time she stood with her back to me, working through something she had no clean answer. She could have left. She had every reason to. She was a medic. And somewhere in the ruins of a city my unit had destroyed, she had decided that what meant was bigger than which side of a war you happened to be born on. I have been trying to live up to that ever since.